Good evening. Welcome back. Or, if this is your first night here, welcome. Come in. The fire is lit and nothing tonight is urgent. This is the sleepy history of medicine. Long, quiet documentaries about how human beings have tried to heal each other, told slowly, in the dark, at the pace of a fireside story. You don't have to follow any of it. Nothing will be on the test. If you drift off somewhere between a Greek temple porch and a night nurse's lamp, and both are coming, then the evening has done exactly what it was built to do. Before we sit down, come stand across the street from a building. It is late. Properly late. The hour when the city has finally given up. The shops are dark. The offices are dark. The houses are dark. We're down to one blue television flicker. And in the middle of all that sleep stands the one building that never joins it. A big, plain block of a place. And it is awake. Count the lit windows. A corridor's long ribbon of light on the 4th floor. A stairwell, glowing top to bottom like a filament. A single warm rectangle up on 6, where someone is sitting with someone. And down behind the entrance canopy, a wide, low blaze of light, where the doors never lock. Where at this hour, in this city and every city, anyone on earth can walk in off the dark street and say, "Help me," and the building is obliged to answer. We have told you a story about a lit window at night before. In our last episode, it was the White House in the summer of 1924. A lamp burning in a sick room where the most powerful man alive sat helpless because the whole world's medicine had nothing to send in. Hold tonight's windows against that one and feel the difference. That lamp meant there is nothing more we can do. These windows mean something else entirely. They mean someone is on duty. Every episode of the series has walked through this building. We have stood in Al-Razi's Baghdad wards and Venice's island lazarettos, in Semmelweis's 2 Vienna clinics and the polio wards with their breathing machines, at Albert Alexander's bedside in Oxford and behind the counter of the pharmacy downstairs more times than we can count. We have used its rooms the whole time and never once told the story of the house itself. Tonight we do. It is a strange story, older than most nations and stranger than most inventions, because a hospital is not an obvious thing to build. For most of human history, the sick were cared for by their families or not at all, and no one in the ancient world, not the pyramid builders, not the Greeks at their proudest, thought to raise a roof under which strangers would tend strangers simply because they were sick, simply because they were there. That idea had to be invented. It was invented surprisingly late, in a particular century, on purpose, and once it existed, it grew through every age of this series. Temple porch, charity ward, great stone barn of mercy, machine of glass and light, until it became the building across the street, humming at 3 a.m, keeping the whole city's worst night at bay so the city can sleep. So settle in. The fire is warm. The building is watching. And our story begins, of all places, with people going to a temple to do exactly what you are about to do. To lie down, close their eyes, and hope for healing in their sleep. Chapter 1. The Sleeping Cure. Begin in Greece, in the 4th century before our era, on a warm hillside in the eastern Peloponnese, at Epidaurus, the most famous address in the ancient world for the sick. People came to it from every shore of the Mediterranean. Farmers with failing eyes, merchants with stones, women who could not conceive, soldiers with old wounds that had never closed. They came by ship and mule track, sometimes across weeks, to a green sanctuary of colonnades and plane trees with a theater so acoustically perfect that tour guides still drop coins on its stage, and they came for a treatment that this series, of all series, is honor-bound to admire. At the heart of the sanctuary of Asclepius, god of healing, the central therapeutic act, the procedure itself, the thing you traveled all that way to do, was this. You went to sleep. Let us walk through it properly, because the ritual is lovely and the details are the point. You arrived, and you purified yourself. Baths, simple offerings, a period of waiting. The sanctuary set its own unhurried pace, which was, we may suspect, already half the medicine. When your night came, you were led into a long, porticoed hall called the Abaton, the place not to be walked upon, forbidden to everyone but the sick. And there on pallets, among strangers gathered from all over the world with their own aches and their own hopes, you lay down for the sacred sleep. The practice has a name that sounds like what it is. Incubation. Lying in for the god. In the dark, it was said, Asclepius made his rounds, a bearded figure with a staff, visiting his patients in their dreams, sometimes touching the afflicted part, sometimes administering a remedy, sometimes accompanied by his sacred snakes, which slid among the sleepers and healed with a touch of the tongue. In the morning you told your dream to the priests, who interpreted what the god had prescribed. You made your offering. And, the Steles insist, remarkably often, you went home well. Ah yes, the Steles. Epidaurus kept records, and this is the part of the sanctuary this series loves best. Set up in the sanctuary for every visitor to read were tall inscribed stones, the iamata, the cures, dozens of case reports carved in marble. Name, home city, complaint, dream, outcome. A man blind in one eye sleeps, dreams the god pours in a medicine, wakes seeing. A woman carries a false pregnancy for 5 years, the stone is not embarrassed. Sleeps the sleep and is delivered. A man with a stone dreams of a beautiful boy and wakes relieved of it. A skeptic mocks the cures on his way in, and is healed anyway, and fined for the mockery. And the fine is recorded too, with what one can only call institutional satisfaction. Read is medicine. The iamata are testimonials. Antiquities 5-star reviews, curated by the management. Survivors' stories with the failures filed under silence. exactly like the patent medicine pamphlets of our first episode. But read his records, they are something more interesting. A healing institution keeping case notes, name, presentation, intervention, outcome, 7 centuries before Al-Razi's notebooks. The instinct to write the patient down was born in a temple. Medicine would spend the rest of this series deciding what to do with it. And the snakes deserve their minute because you have seen them today. The sacred serpent of Asclepius, a real species, a handsome yellowish-brown constrictor, still called the Aesculapian snake, kept live in the sanctuaries, and legend says, carried in state to found new ones, coiled itself around the god's walking staff and became his emblem, a single snake on a rough stick. Follow that image forward 25 centuries, and it is hanging within a few miles of you right now, on the sign of a pharmacy, on the badge of an ambulance, on the caduceus confused letterheads of half the world's health ministries. The 2 snaked winged wand is Hermes, and belongs, an irony this series treasures, to commerce. The medical article is 1 snake, 1 staff, no wings, a mix-up we file gently beside Listerine. Our second episode gave the pharmacy its emblem, the mortar and pestle. Here's medicine's other great logo, born in a building where the prescription was sleep. One more Epidaurian detail, and it is the one our regular listeners have been waiting for. The customary thank offering to Asclepius upon a cure was modest. Very often, a rooster. Hold that homely bird in mind and hear again the last words of Socrates, which we read together in our Poisons episode, in that unbearably calm death scene from the Phaedo. Credo, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Pay it, and do not forget. The philosopher's final joke, with the hemlock rising past his waist, that death itself had cured him of something, and the god's usual fee was owed. It is the same fee, the same god, the same ledger of cures, and it tells you how completely the sleeping temples had settled into the furniture of the ancient mind, even dying. A Greek reached for the accounting of the sanctuary. Now, because this series is what it is, the honest questions. Did it work? And was it a hospital? Did it work, often enough, plainly, to keep the sanctuaries thronged for 800 years? And the honest accounting is neither sneer nor surrender. The sleeping cure bundled together almost everything we now know to be genuinely therapeutic, that requires no drug at all. Journey and hope. A protected place away from the household's noise and worry, rest, baths, regular food. The undivided attention of an institution to your complaint. The expectation of improvement, ritually reinforced at every step, and sleep itself, night after night, in quantity. Half of what a modern hospital does for many of its patients, and any honest clinician will nod along, is exactly this list. Our first episode called its cousin the placebo effect, and watched it sell radium water. Here it is at its most benign, organized into architecture. The temples had, in effect, discovered the hotel half of medicine, the healing that comes from being taken in, put to bed and attended, and built it beautifully, on the best real estate in Greece, with a theater attached. What they had not discovered was the other half, and no dream would supply it for another 2,000 years. This series has spent 7 episodes on what that other half cost. And was it a hospital? Here's the chapter's quiet turn, and the door to everything that follows. No. And the reasons why not are as illuminating as the colonnades. The sanctuary welcomed the sick, but on conditions. You came as a suppliant, not a patient. You had to get yourself there, pay your way, perform the rites. There was no nursing to speak of. No one fed you through a fever for weeks or cleaned you when you could not. Attendants managed ritual, not bodies. And most tellingly of all, the sanctuary, as a rule, would not receive the 2 kinds of people who most define a hospital's duty: the dying and the laboring. Birth and death polluted sacred ground. The rules of ritual purity pushed both outside the walls, at Epidaurus eventually, into buildings placed just beyond the boundary for the purpose. The god's house was for the curable, the desperate, the hopeless case, the pauper with no offering, the stranger dying in the road, had no claim on it whatsoever. Sit with that for a moment, because it defines the missing thing more precisely than any definition. Antiquity could build superbly for the sick. What it could not yet imagine was an institution whose door opened because you were desperate, a house where the stranger's need itself was the ticket of admission, where the dying were not pollution but the point. That idea is not medical at all when you look at it squarely. It is moral. It required somebody to believe that the sick stranger, unknown, unproductive, possibly incurable, owed nothing, had a claim on other human beings, strong enough to build walls and fund beds around. No one in the classical world believed that, or at least no one built it. Their philanthropy raised theaters and baths and porticos for citizens, not wards for the anonymous. The belief would arrive from elsewhere, from a direction the marble sanctuaries did not expect. And when it did, within a few generations, it would raise a new kind of building entirely and give this episode its true subject. The temples themselves met a quieter end. As the new faith spread, the sanctuaries of the healing God were closed, converted, quarried, and in a symmetry too neat for fiction, some of their precincts and their island shrines came to host, in later centuries, churches and charitable houses for the sick. The real estate, so to speak, stayed in the family. The last recorded dreams fade out of the record around the 5th century of our era. But do not mourn the sleeping cure too quickly. Hold on to its 2 best inventions, the case record and the healing power of being taken in and put properly to bed, because both are coming back before this evening ends, the first in a Baghdad ward, and the second in its fullest flower in a chapter near the end of tonight about the quietest shift in the modern world. The next chapter, though, belongs to the missing idea, to the strange, late, world-changing invention of mercy with a roof on it. It begins in an army camp on the Rhine, detours through a bishop with a building site, and turns on a grumpy letter written by the last pagan emperor of Rome, complaining, bitterly, and for our purposes, perfectly, that the Christians were caring for everybody's sick and making the old gods look bad. Chapter 2, The Invention of Mercy. If the ancient world was going to build a true hospital anywhere, the smart money would have said Rome. And Rome came close, twice, in two very different uniforms. Both attempts are worth our fireside minute, because their limits draw the outline of the missing idea more sharply than any philosophy. The first uniform was military. You may remember from our apothecary episode, where Rome's most organized medicine lived, not in the forum, but on the frontier, in the army's purpose-built hospitals, the valetudinaria, laid out to a standard plan at the great legionary forts, with wards and courtyards and supply rooms. Archaeology keeps finding their traces, most famously at Neuss on the Rhine, where the soil still held the seeds of the standard remedies, henbane among them. The pharmacopoeia of empire and botanical trace counted out by some unthanked quartermaster. A valetudinarium was, in plain terms, a real hospital. Beds, staff, stores, records, even a design so consistent that excavators can name the rooms. And yet notice the admission criteria, because they are the whole point. You got in by being a soldier. The empire built these houses for the same reason it built roads, to maintain an asset. A legionary was expensive to train. His fever was a logistics problem. The ward was the repair shop. It was superb, and it was not mercy. When the legion moved on, the valetudinarium was abandoned with the fort, and no one ever thought to build one in a city, for people who merely happened to be sick. The second uniform was wealth. Rich Romans and Greeks gave enormously to their cities. It was practically a competitive sport with inscriptions for scorekeeping. And their gifts built theaters, baths, aqueducts, temples, porticos, feasts. What they did not build anywhere in 1,000 years of lavish civic philanthropy was a ward for the sick poor. The gap was not stinginess. It was a genuine hole in the moral imagination of the age. Classical generosity flowed toward the city, toward citizens, toward glory, toward the reciprocal web of favor and honor, and the sick stranger stood outside every one of those categories. No vote, no name, no capacity to repay, nothing to inscribe. Ancient medicine's own ethics pointed the same way. Physicians were widely advised, in perfect seriousness, to decline hopeless cases. Attempting the incurable was bad for the art's reputation and the practitioners alike. The dying pauper at the gate was not anyone's job. Not the doctors, not the cities, not the gods. We watched the sanctuaries themselves turn that patient away at the boundary stone last chapter, for ritual purity's sake. Every institution of antiquity, confronted with the person who most needed a hospital, had a reason to look elsewhere. What changed was not medicine. Nothing in this chapter involves a new drug, a new theory, a new instrument. What changed was a proposition about human beings, carried out of Judea by a small, strange, spreading sect, and it can be stated in a sentence. The sick stranger is not nobody. The sick stranger is the whole point. The new faith put the destitute sick at the center of its moral map. Its founder had healed beggars and touched lepers and announced, in words its followers could not easily wriggle out of, that whatever was done for the least and sickest was done for him personally. Care of the sick stopped being a private virtue and became a communal obligation, organized, funded, expected. For 2 centuries, the organizing stayed small and half hidden with the church itself. Deacons and widows charged with visiting the sick, congregational funds for the poor, bishops keeping, this detail belongs in our series, lists of those needing care, the ledger of mercy before the buildings of mercy. Then the empire stopped persecuting the sect, and the sect, quite suddenly, could build. What it built first, and where, historians still argue about. And this series, as promised in the outline of its heart, will not crown a single winner where the record crowns several. But one project stands so tall in the sources that every telling must walk through it. In the countryside outside Caesarea, in Cappadocia, modern central Turkey, in the years around 370 of our era, the local bishop, Basil, raised something that contemporaries struggled to name because nothing like it had existed. A whole charitable campus, lodgings for travelers and the poor, a house for the aged, a place for lepers where the bishop was seen to tend the untouchable with his own hands, and the heart of it, quarters for the sick with attendants, physicians, and nurses attached. People took to calling it simply the Basiliad, Basil's city. One admirer called it a new city outright and ranked it among the wonders of the world. Strip away the rhetoric and look at the criteria this series has been carrying since chapter 1. The door opened because of need. Strangers were nursed by strangers, bodily, through the whole course of illness. The dying were not pollution but the priority, and no one presented a bill. Whether or not we call it the first hospital, earlier and simpler guest houses for the sick poor, the Xenodochia, were already multiplying in the Christian East. And Rome's valetudinaria have their partisans. The Basiliad is where the idea stands up in the historical record, fully formed, with a bishop's budget behind it. The missing invention of the entire ancient world turns out to have been, of all things, a building with a moral. The idea spread with the speed of things whose time has come. Within a generation, hospitals and hospices were rising across the Greek East, attached to churches, funded by bishops and emperors and repentant magnates, staffed increasingly by monks, for whom the nursing of the sick was written directly into the rules of the new monastic movement. In the Latin West, the same seed arrived in Rome itself around 390, planted, the sources delight in telling us, by a woman, Fabiola, a wealthy Roman aristocrat with a scandalous divorce behind her and a convert's thoroughness, who founded what her friend Jerome calls the first nosocomium, sick house, in the city, and did not fund it from a distance. Jerome describes her carrying in the diseased and dying off the streets with her own arms, washing wounds that others could not look at, and spending her fortune down to the ground. When she died, he says, Rome turned out for her funeral as for a triumph. File her beside the great founders because she is one. The hospital came to Western Europe not as an institution of the state or the medical profession, but as one determined widow's answer to what she found lying in the road. And for the neatest possible proof that something real had changed, this series calls its favorite kind of witness, a hostile one. In the early 360s, between Basil's education and his building site, The empire briefly passed to Julian, the last pagan emperor, a serious, austere man determined to roll history back and restore the old gods. Julian understood exactly where the new faith's power lay, and it galled him. Writing to one of his pagan high priests, he ordered the establishment of guest houses and charity in every city, and complained, in almost these words, and the letter survives, that it was disgraceful that the impious Galileans supported not only their own poor, but ours as well, while our people looked in vain for help from us. Read that again, slowly, because it is the whole chapter notarized by the opposition. The Emperor of Rome, commanding paganism to invent institutional charity in self-defense, and admitting in writing that the enemy's hospitals were winning the argument. His restoration died with him within the year. The buildings did not. Let the fire settle and say plainly what happened here, because it is easy to hurry past. Somewhere in the 4th century, for the first time in recorded history, civilization acquired a building whose entire purpose was that the suffering of a stranger obligates you. A roof raised over the exact person every previous institution had excused itself from. Too poor for the physician, too polluted for the temple, too useless for the city. Everything else in tonight's episode, the golden bimaristans, the great stone wards, the charity subscriptions, the gleaming machine across the street from our cold open, is elaboration on that one act of moral architecture. The elaborations will add medicine, which this founding generation conspicuously lacked. A basileid could hold you and feed you and pray over you, but its pharmacy was thin, and its theory was Galen's, and centuries of the wards this chapter built would offer more comfort than cure. This series has never once sneered at comfort and declines to begin now, taken in, kept warm, fed, washed, and not left to die alone by the measure of everything before it. That was the miracle. But the marriage of the new mercy to actual, ambitious, bedside medicine, physicians on rounds, pharmacies on site, case notes, teaching, the hospital as an engine for getting better, that happens somewhere particular, east again, in a young civilization about to have its golden age, in cities where this series has already spent some of its happiest evenings. The road to the modern hospital runs, as so many of our roads have run, straight through Baghdad. Chapter 3: The House of the Sick. Our second episode called them, in passing, the world's first great hospitals, and promised we would come back. Tonight, we walk in. The word itself is a small history lesson. Bimaristan, Persian, not Arabic, from Bimar. Sick, and stan, place. The house of the sick. The young Islamic civilization that raised these institutions assembled them, with characteristic confidence, from every inheritance on its shelf. the Christian hospital and hospice tradition it absorbed with the conquered Byzantine East, including, by the accounts, the famous medical school and infirmary culture of Gundishapur in Persia, whose physicians came to serve the new caliphs, the Greek medicine of Galen and Dioscorides, translated wholesale in Baghdad's academies, and Islam's own institutional genius, which we will come to, for making charity permanent. By the early 9th century, within a couple of generations of Baghdad's founding as that brand new round city on the Tigris, the capital had hospitals. By the golden noon of the 10th and 11th centuries, every great city of the Islamic world had them, and the greatest had several, and they were, by every surviving description, the most medically ambitious buildings on earth. Begin with the story every history of the bimaristan tells, because it stars an old friend. When a new hospital was to be founded at Baghdad, so the tradition goes, the physician charged with citing it was al-Razi. Raises, the great clinician of our second and third episodes, the man who distinguished smallpox from measles and checked Galen against the ward, asked where the hospital should stand. Al-Razi ordered joints of fresh meat hung up in the various quarters of the city and watched them across the days. Where the meat was slowest to spoil there, where the air was sweetest, the hospital was built. The story is late, and historians hedge it, and this series hedges with them. But we tell it anyway, with pleasure, because true or polished it preserves exactly what the era believed a hospital deserved, the best air in the city, chosen empirically by the man with the sharpest eyes in medicine. 14 chapters of this series have taught you to hear the rhyme, the same instinct in another key, that would put Florence Nightingale's windows and Epidaurus's plane trees where they are. Everyone in this episode agrees on one thing across 3,000 years. Bad air is the enemy, and the building must breathe. Now step inside a great bimaristan at the tradition's height, assembling the picture from the source's descriptions, and prepare, as the travelers of the age were, to be astonished. The wards are divided by condition. Fevers here, wounds and fractures there, eye diseases, the great specialty of the medieval East. In their own hall, the flux kept apart from the rest, and separate wards, in the well-endowed houses for the disturbed in mind, whose treatment in these institutions, with baths and music and gentleness, stood centuries ahead of anything Europe would manage. There are courtyards with fountains for the sound of water. The accounts of the grandest foundations speak of music, and in some tellings, storytellers and reciters, entertainment prescribed for the sleepless and the melancholy, which this series records with its hat off, a medieval institution that treated insomnia as a medical problem deserving staff. There is a dispensary. Of course there is. This is the civilization that invented the pharmacy 2 episodes ago, staffed by its own pharmacists, compounding to physicians' orders from formularies written for hospital use. There are teaching rounds, the chief physician processing ward to ward, trailed by students, examining, questioning, correcting, the clinical education of Europe 1,000 years later, already in session. There are case records. Al-Razi's notebooks, you'll remember, were built from exactly this ward walking. And at the door, this is the detail to sleep on. The rule. written into foundation deeds. The house takes everyone. Muslim, Christian, Jew, citizen and traveler, man and woman, rich and above all, poor. Treatment without charge, as a matter not of occasional charity, but of standing law. How does a civilization make such a thing permanent? Here's the quiet mechanism under the marble, and it is one of the great inventions in tonight's story. The waqf, the pious endowment. A founder, caliph, vizier, wealthy widow, deeded productive property in perpetuity to God for a stated charitable purpose. These shops, that caravanserai, those orchards, their rents assigned forever to this hospital, this deed, these terms. The property could never again be sold, inherited, or taxed away. Administrators were named. The founding document spelled out staffing and services down to the kitchen. It is the same instrument in a different legal dress as the endowments that would later hold up Europe's colleges and almshouses and, in time, its hospitals. Charity converted from an impulse into an income stream, mercy with a rent roll. The Basiliad ran on a bishop's budget and died with its diocese's fortunes. The great bimaristans ran on endowments and ran for centuries. This series has spent 7 episodes admiring the ledger as medicine's secret weapon. Here is the ledger keeping the building alive. Of all the houses, one deserves the full fireside portrait because it was the wonder of its age. The Mansuri Hospital in Cairo, founded in 1284 by the Mamluk Sultan Qalawun, a soldier king who, the story goes, had been treated in the great Nuri Hospital of Damascus as a young officer and vowed to outbuild it. He converted a palace, and the scale of the result made travelers reach for their superlatives. Courtyards and halls arranged around fountains, wards for every class of illness, a staff of physicians and attendants of both sexes, its own pharmacy, lecture hall, and library. And capacity figures that grew in the telling until later accounts speak of thousands of patients at once, numbers historians treat as the complement rather than the census, and so shall we. What the foundation deed itself makes plain is the philosophy, and 2 of its provisions belong in this series' permanent collection. The endowment declared the hospital open to all who came, the Sultan's deed spelling out, in the lawyer's fullness, that no one was to be turned away for poverty or origin, and that the sick would be kept until fully recovered. And recovery had a definition with paperwork attached. By the accounts of the institution, a patient was not discharged until he could, the formula is beautiful, eat a whole chicken. And on leaving, the poor were given money and clothes, so that no one need step from the ward straight back into the destitution that had helped fell them. Hedge the details as the historians do. The direction is documented and the direction is the point. 600 years before the phrase existed, the Mansuri's deed was worrying about what we now call discharge planning. And its solution was to hand the recovered pauper a stipend at the door. There are hospital administrators alive tonight who will hear that and sigh like the fire. The tradition's reach was long. The bimaristan model traveled west along Islam's whole map: Damascus, Cairo, Kairouan, Cordoba, Granada, and stood quite literally next door to Europe for centuries. Pilgrims, crusaders, merchants, and translated books all carried descriptions of the sick houses of the East back across the frontier, and historians trace real influence into the hospital foundations of the Mediterranean, the military nursing orders of the crusader states among the carriers, and one of those orders is waiting at the top of our very next chapter. Some of the buildings themselves proved almost unreasonably durable. Hospitals of this tradition were still treating patients in some cities into the 19th century. And in at least one famous case, a medieval bimaristans successor institutions carry its founder's endowment forward in Cairo to this day, which would have satisfied the lawyers who drafted the Waqf immensely. Before we cross back into Europe, pause on what the bimaristan had achieved, because tonight's episode pivots on it. Chapter 1 gave us healing without mercy, the sanctuary that turned the dying away. Chapter 2 gave us mercy without much medicine, the ward that could comfort but rarely cure. The house of the sick, at its golden age best, is the first place in the story where the two halves meet. The Basiliad's open door and Al-Razi's case notes, the nursing sister's patience and the pharmacist's shelf, charity endowed like a fortune and medicine taught like a science under one roof with fountains. It would be too tidy to say the modern hospital was born in medieval Baghdad and Cairo. The line from there to the building across the street runs through too many other rooms, and this episode intends to walk most of them. But every essential organ of the creature, open admission, divided wards, resident physicians, teaching rounds, records, a staffed pharmacy, an endowment to keep the lights on, is present and functioning in the bimaristan, while Europe's medicine is still mostly monks and prayers. And it is to Europe, monks and prayers and all, that the story now returns. Because while the East built houses of the sick, the West was slowly filling with a different institution. Vast, holy, crowded, chaotic, occasionally horrifying, and warm-hearted to its stone bones. The age of the great wards of God. Chapter 4 The Great Wards of God. Begin this chapter with a single Latin word, because an entire civilization's answer to illness is folded inside it. The word is hospice, and its genius is that it means both host and guest, the one who takes in and the one who is taken in, sharing a single name, as though the language itself had decided the two roles were interchangeable and holy. From hospice, the medieval centuries spun a whole family of buildings, and English still wears every one of them. Hospitality, the virtue. Hostel and hotel, the roofs for travelers. Hospice, the rest house on the pilgrim road that became, in our own age, the house of the gentlest kind of care. And hospital, which in the Middle Ages meant magnificently vaguely any house of taking in. A medieval hospital might shelter pilgrims, orphans, the old, the blind, the mad, the leprous, the merely destitute, and the sick all together in any mixture, because to its builders these were not different problems. They were all guests. They were all, in the reckoning that chapter 2 installed in the West, the same person in different rags, and the buildings raised for them, across 5 centuries, became the largest charitable infrastructure Europe had ever seen. By the High Middle Ages, thousands upon thousands of hospitals, great and small, until scarcely a market town in Christendom lacked its God's house at the gate. The engine of it all, first, was the monastery. And here we revisit rooms our apothecary episode furnished. The monastic rule made hospitality and the care of the sick a duty of the house. The ideal plan of St. Gall, you'll remember, drew its infirmary and its physic garden, those 16 tidy beds of herbs, right into the cloister's design. And the infirmarian with his still room was Europe's working pharmacist for centuries, dosing the brothers through their ailments and their scheduled bloodletting holidays. But the monastery nursed chiefly its own, plus guests of the road. The sick poor of the towns needed houses of their own. They got them. From bishops, from guilds, from kings ransoming their souls, from burghers doing the same on a budget, and the greatest of these town foundations grew into legends with addresses. Paris had the grandest, the Hôtel Dieu, the Hostel of God, the name alone a sermon. Planted beside Notre Dame on the cathedral's island, ancient beyond sure founding dates, and by the later Middle Ages, an enormous complex of long stone wards running down to the Seine, the busiest hospital in Europe and, for our purposes, the archetype of everything glorious and appalling about the great wards of God. Walk its central hall in your mind, at document's distance. The ward is built like a church, because to its builders it was one. A long nave lined with beds, an altar at the head, so that the sick could hear Mass from where they lay. Healing of body and soul administered as a single treatment. Architecture as theology. The nursing is done by religious sisters. At the Hôtel Dieu, the Augustinian nuns, whose order served that single hospital for the better part of 1,000 years, one of the longest unbroken caregiving institutions in human history, and the plain refutation of any telling that starts professional nursing in the 19th century. And the conditions, this series keeps its ledger honest, were in the crowded centuries dreadful by any modern measure. The records themselves speak of several patients to a bed, the fevered beside the convalescent, the dying beside the newly delivered, of air the age itself complained of mortality that made the pious weep and the reformers, when reformers finally came, reach for their pamphlets. Hold both truths, because both are true. The great ward was, by later standards, a dangerous place to be sick, and it was also for the pauper shivering on the Ile de la Cité in 1350, the only roof in the world that wanted him, with a bed, a blanket, sisters who had vowed their lives to his comfort and a candle burning at the altar all night. This series has never once sneered at comfort. The cure rate of the medieval hospital was low. Its mercy rate was the highest yet achieved. Two more foundations, briefly, because their stories are too good to leave in the footnotes, and both are still in business. In the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem, the military religious order that took its very name from the work, the Knights Hospitaller of St. John, ran a hospital for pilgrims and the sick that awed visitors of every faith, hundreds upon hundreds of beds, a diet the statutes specify with loving detail, white bread, meat, the sick to eat before the brethren, and a rule whose language this series has been saving for tonight. The knights were to serve. The phrase recurs in their own documents. Our lords the sick. Not our patients, not our charges. Our lords, the highest-born knight in the order, owed the beggar in the bed the deference owed a master, because in that bed, by the theology of the house, lay Christ. Take the phrase as the Middle Ages' whole hospital philosophy in 3 words, the exact, deliberate inversion of every classical instinct Chapter 2 catalogued, and note, with the fireside's respect, that the order it belongs to survives today as a charitable body whose ambulances you have seen at street fairs, the St. John of the name. And in London, in 1123, a courtier of Henry I named Rahere, a man the chroniclers describe wonderfully as something between a minstrel and a fixer, fell sick on pilgrimage to Rome and vowed in his fever that if he lived, he would build a hospital for the poor. He lived, came home, and raised St. Bartholomew's in Smithfield, where it has operated, through plague, fire, dissolution, and blitz, for 900 years and counting, the oldest hospital in Britain still on its original site, born, like so much in tonight's story, from one frightened person's bargain in the dark. The medieval map had darker districts too, and this series walks them plainly. Outside the towns stood the leper houses, the lazar houses, hundreds in England alone, where those with the age's most feared diagnosis lived apart, under rule, sometimes for decades, part hospital, part monastery, part exile. The telling that remembers only the exile forgets that the houses were also endowed care. Beds, chapels, gardens, brethren. For people antiquity would simply have driven out. And the telling that remembers only the care forgets the bell some inmates carried on the roads to warn the healthy of their coming. Both bells ring in this history. We have heard their descendants before. The searcher's rules of the plague episode, quarantine's hard mercies. And the lesson is the same one. The medieval hospital system could hold compassion and segregation in the same hand without feeling the contradiction. Its heirs would spend centuries learning to feel it. One last stop in Florence, because it points the way out of the Middle Ages. Santa Maria Nuova, founded in 1288 by the father of Dante's Beatrice. The connection is real and too pretty to omit. Grew into the model hospital of the Renaissance. Hundreds of beds, one patient to each. The statutes insisted, pointedly. And after the crowded wards of Paris, hear what a revolution hides in that plain arithmetic. A bed of one's own, as written policy 500 years before it was universal. Salaried physicians on rounds, its own celebrated pharmacy, systematic record-keeping, and a reputation so bright that when Henry VII of England resolved to build his great Savoy hospital in London, he sent to Florence for a copy of Santa Maria Nuova's regulations, which were delivered to him, history arranging its symmetries with a flourish, by a Portinari, a descendant of the founder's own family, carrying the founder's rule book to a king. And when the young Leonardo da Vinci wanted to learn what human beings looked like beneath the skin, it was in this hospital's mortuary, by its candlelight, that he conducted the dissections behind the anatomical drawings the world has marveled at ever since. The hospital, by the 15th century, already becoming what it would remain, the place where medicine learns. Europe's gods' houses were turning, slowly, into something the bimaristan would have recognized. And then, in the 16th century, half of Europe's hospital system was abruptly beheaded. Where the Reformation dissolved the monasteries, it dissolved the hospitals with them, and cities from London to the Baltic had to reinvent, in a scramble of royal refoundations and civic takeovers. Barts itself was saved this way, by a grudging Henry. The institutions their new theology had orphaned. The scramble planted a seed that the next chapter will watch flower. If the church no longer automatically kept the God's house, then the town would have to. The merchant, the subscriber, the committee. Mercy was about to acquire trustees, minute books, and an annual dinner, which is to say, the hospital was about to become respectable, fashionable, and, in the hands of a bubble speculator, a painter with a grudge, and our old friend Benjamin Franklin, very nearly a form of entertainment. The age of the charity hospital is next, and it begins with the most improbable founder in this entire episode, a man who made a fortune in the South Sea bubble and spent it on beds. Chapter 5. Hogarth's Hospital. Thomas Guy was, by the cheerful agreement of his contemporaries, one of the least likely saints in London. A bookseller and Bible printer of legendary frugality. The stories of his patched coat and his dinner of yesterday's loaf were told with relish in his lifetime. Who had built a solid fortune, and then, in 1720, did something that should by rights have destroyed it. He speculated in the South Sea Company, the great bubble itself, the mania this series would file happily beside its radium waters and miracle tonics. A company whose stock rose on nothing but the century's appetite for believing. Guy rode the rise, and then, with the bookseller's cold eye that a lifetime of counting pennies had given him, sold near the top, months before the bubble burst and ruined half of fashionable England. He walked away with one of the great liquid fortunes of the age. And then, past 70, unmarried, with no heirs he cared for, Thomas Guy spent it on the thing he had been quietly circling for years as a governor of St. Thomas's Hospital across the road. He built, at his own sole cost, an entire new hospital for the incurables and the chronically sick that even the existing charities turned away, and endowed it like a college. Guy's hospital opened its wards within a year of his death in 1724. stands there still and remains one of history's most satisfying pieces of moral arithmetic. The maddest speculation of the century, converted at the top of the market into 300 years of beds. The bubble ruined thousands. One tight-fisted bookseller made it pay for mercy. Guy's was the spectacular solo performance in what was otherwise a chorus, because the 18th century invented a new way to build hospitals, and the invention mattered more than any single building. The voluntary hospital, funded not by church or crown, but by public subscription. The mechanics were pure ledger, and after 7 episodes you will recognize the music. A committee formed, a subscription book opened, the gentry and merchants of a town signed for annual sums, and in exchange a subscriber received, here's the machinery's clever, slightly compromising heart, the right to recommend patience. Printed admission tickets, so many per year per guinea, which the subscriber bestowed on sick servants, laborers, parishioners, the deserving poor of his acquaintance. Charity Incorporated, with trustees, minute books, audited accounts, an annual sermon, and a fundraising dinner. Within 2 generations, the model carpeted Britain. London alone added the Westminster, Guy's, St. George's, the London, and the Middlesex inside 25 years, and the provinces followed, Edinburgh, Bristol, York, Norwich, until the voluntary infirmary was as standard a fixture of a respectable town as the assembly rooms. This series keeps its honest ledger even for its heroes, and the era's own critics kept it first. Admission by patron's ticket meant the unrecommended, the friendless stranger, the fever case, the incurable, the very people chapters 2 and 3 built for, were often precisely those excluded, and the infectious were barred outright by most house rules. The voluntary hospital was mercy with a membership structure. It was also, count both columns, the largest expansion of hospital beds since the bimaristans, achieved without a single tax, and the germ of every hospital charity, gala held anywhere on earth this coming winter. And it had an artist in residence. William Hogarth, London's great pictorial moralist, whose engravings of the age's follies this series has been resisting the urge to hang in every episode, was a governor of the reborn St. Bartholomew's, and when the hospital's grand new staircase wanted decoration in the 1730s, and word went about that a fashionable foreign painter might get the commission, Hogarth, bristling with professional and patriotic indignation, offered to paint it himself for nothing, and did. 2 enormous canvases, the Pool of Bethesda and the Good Samaritan, Scripture's 2 great scenes of the sick stranger helped, rising up the staircase walls where the patients and governors passed beneath. They hang there still. Read the choice of subjects as the century reading its own institution. The Samaritan, the parable of the wounded stranger and the passer-by who stopped, painted free by a London engraver with a temper in the stairwell of a 900-year-old hospital. And across town, Hogarth threw himself into the era's tenderest foundation, the Foundling Hospital. Chartered in 1739 after the shipwright Thomas Coram spent 17 dogged years petitioning for a house for London's abandoned infants. Hogarth donated paintings and persuaded his friends to do likewise until the Foundlings' courtroom became, in effect, England's first public art gallery. The fashionable came for the pictures and left subscriptions for the babies. And George Friedrich Handel gave annual benefit performances of Messiah in the chapel, raising sums that kept the house afloat. The Hallelujah chorus, quite literally, buying cradles. Art, music, and charity had discovered one another, and the discovery, every benefit concert, every gala, every celebrity ward opening since, has never been allowed to lapse. The tokens mothers left with their infants, a button, a scrap of ribbon, half a coin, against the day they might return, are kept by the Foundlings Museum today. And this series, which has held itself steady through plagues and poisons, suggests you do not look them up until morning. Across the ocean, the idea landed in the lap of exactly the man you would expect. In Philadelphia in 1751, Dr. Thomas Bond wanted a hospital for the sick poor of the fastest-growing town in America and could not raise the money until he recruited Benjamin Franklin, a man this series has stopped being surprised to meet, who took on the scheme with his usual blend of civic virtue and procedural cunning. Franklin petitioned the Pennsylvania Assembly for £2,000 and, meeting skepticism that the public cared, proposed the deal that made history. The Assembly's money would be paid only if private citizens first subscribed a matching £2,000. The skeptical legislators, he later wrote with undisguised satisfaction, conceived they might have the credit of charity without the expense. And the challenge, exactly as he intended, electrified the subscription. The private money came in, the public money followed, and the Pennsylvania hospital rose. The matching grant, the fundraiser's favorite lever from that day to this, invented on the spot by the man who had already given the series its blindfolds, its inoculation arithmetic, and his son's hard lesson. The hospital's first physicians served without pay. Its cornerstone motto and its minute books breathed the same subscription book piety as Bristol's or York's, and American medicine had its founding house. The century's quietest invention, though, may be the one closest to this fireside's usual counter. From the 1770s, alongside the grand infirmaries, reformers began opening dispensaries, modest premises, often a few rooms, where the sick poor could come without any subscriber's ticket, see a physician without charge, and carry away medicines made up on the spot. Some sent their men out to visit the fevered at home, precisely the patients the hospital's rules excluded. London's dispensaries multiplied, and the model spread through Britain and America, and see it for what it is. The missing middle of the whole system, care without admission, medicine without a bed, the ancestor of the outpatient department, the walk-in clinic, and every community pharmacy consultation Mike's profession conducts across a counter to this day. The grand wards got the marble and the paintings. The dispensary got the queue of people who just needed seeing to, and history, which loves a building, has underthanked the rooms ever since. The century even produced the hospital's first full-time inspector, and this series collects such men the way others collect kings. John Howard, a quiet, obsessive Bedfordshire squire, had begun by touring England's prisons and been so appalled that inspection became his life. In the 1770s and 80s, he widened his circuit to the lazarettos and hospitals of all Europe, traveling tens of thousands of miles, walking wards from Dublin to Constantinople with a notebook and a set of scales, measuring, counting beds, sniffing the air, recording diets and death rates with the deadpan precision that shames better than any rhetoric. He inspected the quarantine stations our plague episode built, submitted himself voluntarily to a full quarantine to document it from inside, and died on the road, of fever in the south of Russia, still inspecting. His books put numbers on what everyone half knew, that the Ages hospitals, for all their new marble, were killing a portion of their guests, crowded, unventilated, and haunted by what the era called hospital fever, which we, from the far side of episode 5, can name as typhus, the louse-born companion of every crowded institution, plus the whole invisible menagerie our 7th episode finally caught. The grandest voluntary hospitals had death rates their own annual reports blushed at. The writers coined a word, hospitalism, for the paradox of the healing house that harmed. By 1800, the building had conscience, committees, art, music, endowments, and inspectors. What it did not have was safety. And the distance between a hospital and a safe hospital would be closed in the next 2 chapters by a woman with a compass-drawn chart and by the ward-scrubbing revolution whose story we told 2 episodes ago and now watch arrive at last in the architecture. Chapter 6. The Lady with the Data. Every institution in this series eventually meets the person who counts it, and the hospital's counter arrived in the autumn of 1854, aboard a ship to Constantinople at the head of 38 nurses, carrying, though the newspapers preferred the lamp, the most dangerous weapon this series knows, a genius for statistics. The story the world got first is the one everybody still half remembers, so let us give it its due before we do our usual work on it. Britain had stumbled into war with Russia in the Crimea, and the war had immediately become a hospital scandal. The wounded, and far more numerously, the sick, were being shipped across the Black Sea to a vast barrack hospital at Scutari, opposite Constantinople, and dying there in numbers the era's brand new invention, the war correspondent, reported home with unprecedented speed and fury. Into the outrage stepped Florence Nightingale, 34, formidably educated. Her mathematics tutoring was a family scandal in itself. Young ladies were not supposed to want trigonometry. Experienced in hospital management, superbly connected, and appointed, over considerable official harumphing, to lead the first party of female nurses ever attached to the British Army. What she found at Scutari the ledger can carry better than any description. In the worst winter months, the hospitals of the East were burying, of the men admitted to them, a proportion that the eventual Royal Commission would put in the range of 2 in every 5. A mortality worse than the battlefields, in the beds meant to be the refuge from it. The nurses scrubbed, cooked, dressed wounds, wrote dying men's letters. Nightingale herself walked the 4 miles of corridors at night with her Turkish lantern and the Times readers, hungry for one bright thing in a dark war, fixed on that image, the lady with the lamp, and made her, within months, the most famous woman in the empire after the Queen. Here's the part the lamp obscured, and the reason she belongs in this series' first rank. The mortality at Scutari did not fall because of lamplight or even chiefly nursing. It fell, and it fell off a cliff after the spring of 1855, when a sanitary commission sent from London flushed the sewers beneath the hospital, cleared the water supply, which proved to be flowing past dead animals and worse, broke open the ventilation, and generally performed upon the building itself the surgery it needed. The barrack hospital had been, in the plainest terms of our 5th and 7th episodes, an engine for fever, crowding, filth, foul water, bad air, the ancient enemies, concentrated under one enormous roof. And the person who proved that, who came home from the war, and instead of accepting the nation's adoration, spent 2 obsessed years dissecting the mortality returns until the cause of death stood exposed in the arithmetic, was Nightingale herself. She had the honesty to include her own hospital in the indictment. The analysis showed the men had died overwhelmingly, not of wounds, but of preventable disease, at Scutari worst of all. And the conclusion she drew was the founding sentence of everything this chapter builds. The hospital had killed them, and the hospital could be redesigned so that it would not. And because she needed to convince generals, ministers, and a queen, audiences, she noted dryly, not to be reached by tables of figures, she drew the figures instead. Her famous chart of the war's mortality, the one now called the Rose Diagram or Polar Area Chart. Each month a wedge of the circle, each wedge's area sized to the deaths, colored by cause, blue-gray for preventable disease, red for wounds, so that the eye takes in, faster than the mind can resist, the great blue-gray blooms of unnecessary death dwarfing the red of battle, month after month, until the sanitary reforms bite and the wedges collapse. It is one of the founding masterpieces of statistical graphics, the direct ancestor of every chart that has ever changed a policy, and it was built as a weapon, aimed at specific powerful men by a woman who could not vote, hold office, or address Parliament, and who therefore made the picture do the addressing. The astonished statisticians of the age elected her the Royal Statistical Society's first woman member. She called the study of statistics in her letters a religious duty, reading the laws of God in the numbers. And this series, which has been arguing something similar for 8 episodes, considers her its patron saint and will hear no appeals. What she did with the fame is the part the storybooks skip, and it is the greater half of her life. Returning from the war an invalid, from an illness contracted at Scutari that confined her for most of 5 decades to her rooms. She ran from a sofa in Mayfair, one of the most effective reform campaigns in administrative history. Royal commissions steered, viceroys briefed, hospital plans corrected by post, ministers received one at a time and sent away with homework. Her notes on hospitals codified the pavilion ward. Long, narrow, limited in beds. Windows marching down both walls for cross-ventilation and light. Nurses' station commanding the whole room at a glance. Hospital architecture as preventive medicine. And the wards Britain and half the world then built for a century, many still working tonight, are called Nightingale wards after the sofa they were designed from. Her notes on nursing did for the bedside what the pavilion did for the building. And in 1860, with the fortune a grateful nation had subscribed, she founded the Nightingale Training School at St. Thomas. Probationers in uniform, lectures and ward practice, discipline and a register. The decisive step in turning nursing from a calling of nuns and a refuge of the desperate into a modern profession, the largest one medicine has, whose members tonight outnumber physicians on every night shift on earth, and whose lineage runs in a documented line from that school. The lamp was real, and she carried it. But the monument is the ward built to breathe, the profession built to last, and the chart that taught buildings to confess. One more nurse belongs in this chapter, and this series, which repaired Schatz's ledger and Quietest's, is not going to leave her out. Mary Seacole, Jamaican, a doctress in the Creole herbal tradition, veteran of cholera and yellow fever epidemics in the Caribbean and Panama, who applied to join the Crimean nursing parties and was refused, she wrote afterward, with a directness the reader may weigh, that she could not help wondering whether her complexion was the reason, and who therefore, being Mary Seacole, went anyway, at her own expense, and built with a relative of her late husband a establishment she called the British Hotel on the road to the siege lines. Part store, part canteen, part sick bay, where she doctored, fed, and mothered the army within sound of the guns, riding out to the battlefields themselves with bandages and remedies. The soldiers called her Mother Seacole. The war's end left her bankrupt, and the army she had served answered with a grand military festival in her honor at the Royal Surrey Gardens, 4 nights in the summer of 1857, with a crowd the accounts put at some 40,000 in all, and 1,000 performers. A soldier's eye verdict this series is content to enter as final. She and Nightingale were not rivals, whatever the modern arguments make of them. They were 2 different answers, given simultaneously to the same broken system. The administrator who rebuilt the machine, and the freelancer who simply walked around it to reach the men. The hospital of the future would need both instincts, and any honest telling keeps both lamps lit. Her partner in the arithmetic deserves his sentence too. William Farr, the compiler of England's vital statistics, the direct professional heir of the bills of mortality tradition our plague episode celebrated, Graunt's ledger grown into a government department, worked with Nightingale for years, trading data and drafts. Between them, they pushed for something wonderfully unglamorous that this series refuses to let pass unpraised. Standard hospital statistics, uniform forms, uniform disease categories, uniform definitions of admission, cure, and death, so that one hospital's honesty could finally be compared with another's, and the buildings themselves ranked by results. It did not fully catch on in her lifetime. League tables of hospital outcomes remained, and remain, a fight. But every audit, every published infection rate, every quality dashboard glowing on an administrator's screen tonight descends from that campaign. The rose diagrams, quieter, longer war. She also spent 30 years on the sanitation of India by correspondence, without ever visiting it, and measurably bent the mortality of a subcontinent from her sofa. We mention this partly for justice and partly because it may be the single most sleepy history sentence this series has ever produced. By 1870, the building had learned to breathe, count, and train its own. The ward was aired, spaced, and watched. The nurse was uniformed and schooled. The death rates were published. Nightingale had fought for uniform hospital statistics, naturally, and falling. One enemy remained, and it was the oldest and smallest. The ward could be bright as a Dutch painting and still carry death from bed to bed on the surgeon's own hands. The solution was already brewing. You watched it happen 2 episodes ago in Vienna and Glasgow. And the next chapter is what it did to the building. The short, total war that turned the hospital from the place you might survive into the place you went to be saved. Chapter 7. The War on the Wards. Two episodes ago, we told the story of the men who found the enemy. Tonight, we watch their war arrive in the building. This chapter is deliberately the episode's swiftest. The science is already yours from our antibiotics evening, Semmelweis's basin and Lister's carbolic and all, so we can keep our eyes where this episode keeps them, on the rooms, and what the war did to every one of them. Begin in the room the era itself considered the heart of the hospital, and the one it got most spectacularly wrong, the operating theater. The name is literal. It was a theater, a steep wooden amphitheater of standing rails, packed on operating days with students and spectators, focused down on a stage furnished with a wooden table, a box of sawdust beneath it for the blood, and a surgeon who wore, by the custom of the age, an old frock coat kept for the purpose, stiff, unwashed, its accumulated stains worn frankly as seniority. One such room survives in London, the old operating theater of St. Thomas's, sealed up in a church attic when the hospital moved and rediscovered a century later, sawdust box and all. You can stand at its rail today, and its dimensions teach the whole chapter. The theater was built for speed and spectacle, because before anesthesia speed was the only mercy, and before germ theory, nobody knew the audience's coats, and the surgeon's own hands were part of the disease. We will keep our standing promise. The full story of that room, the speed surgeons, the arrival of ether, the conquest of pain, is its own future evening at this fireside. Tonight needs only the building's ledger, and the era wrote it itself. Hospital surgery in the 1860s carried mortality that its own professors called scandalous. Wounds festered as a matter of course. Laudable pus, the textbook said, in the most wince-inducing adjective in medical history. And the crowded wards behind the theater bred the erysipelas and gangrene and childbed fever that gave the age its bleak proverb about hospital gates and death's door. One eminent surgeon of the era put the arithmetic in a sentence that has rung down the decades, that the man on the operating table of one of our great hospitals stood more chance of death than the soldier on the field of Waterloo. The comparison was rhetorical. The underlying returns, as Chapter 5's inspectors and Chapter 6's Rose diagram showed, were not. Then inside 30 years, the whole picture inverted. And you know the levers. Semmelweis's lesson, vindicated at last by the germ theory that arrived too late for him. Blisters carbolic, fogging the Glasgow theaters from 1867, and then the second, cleaner revolution that outgrew him. Asepsis, not killing the microbes at the wound, but arranging the entire room so they never arrive. Watch what asepsis does to the architecture, because this is the moment the modern hospital interior is born. The wooden amphitheater dies. In its place comes a room you would recognize tonight. Hard, washable surfaces, tile, glass, steel. The audience banished behind glass or banished altogether. Instruments boiled and racked. The wooden table now a steel one. The frock coat replaced by the sterilized gown, the boiled apron, and in time, each arriving as its own small argued-over reform. The rubber gloves, introduced at Johns Hopkins, the charming tradition insists, to spare a nurse's carbolic chapped hands, romance, smuggling, and revolution. The cap, the mask. The scrub enters ritual, minutes of prescribed hand washing, Semmelweis's basin elevated into liturgy. And the cleaner's mop quietly becomes one of the most important medical instruments in the building. This series has honored humble instruments all night, and the disinfected floor belongs on the list. By 1900, the operating theater is the cleanest room most human beings will ever stand in. Within another generation, infection after clean planned surgery has fallen from expectation to event, something investigated, like a crash. And operations no one would have dared attempt on the old table, opening the abdomen electively, the very idea, are becoming routine. Surgery did not just get safer. Whole continents of the body opened to it, and the hospital had to grow new rooms to receive them. It had to grow new departments entirely, because the sciences of our earlier episodes were moving in, each one arriving in the space of a generation and demanding a room, a staff, and a budget. The laboratory first. The microbe hunting of Pasteur and Koch turned diagnosis into something done partly under a microscope, and hospitals began building pathology and bacteriology labs, the plate and the stain, in the basement, on the case, until the physician's eye had a whole department of instruments behind it. Then, with almost comic suddenness, came the X-ray. Röntgen announced his mysterious rays at the very end of 1895, within months, not years. The speed remains one of the fastest technology adoptions in medical history. Hospitals and enterprising photographers on several continents were imaging fractures and swallowed sixpences and embedded bullets. And by the following year, the first hospital X-ray departments were open, complete with a brand new professional, the radiographer. And in time, a brand new lesson in this series' oldest pattern. The early operators, working bare-handed in the invisible beam, paid for the miracle with burns and worse before the shielding rules were written, safety law once again drafted in the aftermath. The hospital was becoming a place you went not only for care but for equipment, for rooms containing machines that existed nowhere else in your town, and that one fact quietly rewrote the institution's entire social contract. And notice who actually ran this revolution, hour by hour, because it was not chiefly the surgeons. Asepsis is not an idea. It is 10,000 small disciplines a day. The boiled instrument actually boiled, the dressing actually changed, the hands actually scrubbed for the full count, the ward corner actually cleaned, and the workforce that made it real was the one Chapter 6 had just professionalized, the trained nurse. The Nightingale School's graduates spread through the hospitals of the world in exactly these decades, carrying the new discipline as their core craft. Matron's ward inspection became the aseptic regime's daily audit, and the fearsome reputation of the era's ward sisters, the gleaming floors, the beds dressed to the inch, the woe awaiting a house officer with dirty cuffs, was not fussiness but infection control before the phrase existed, drill as a form of medicine. The building's other quiet professional grew in the same soil. The hospital dispensary of the subscription era, a cupboard and an apprentice, was becoming a true hospital pharmacy with a formulary of its own, sterile preparations to manage. And once our 6th episode's antitoxins and vaccines arrived needing cold and careful storage, the beginnings of the cold chain custodianship Mike's profession still keeps. The fridge log at 3 a.m. descends from these very decades. The war on the wards was won by celebrated men with theories, enforced by uncelebrated women with checklists, and supplied from a room down the corridor that history keeps forgetting to thank. This series exists partly to thank it. Because here's the flip, and it is the hinge of tonight's whole story. For 13 centuries, from the Basileia to Nightingale, the hospital had been, with few exceptions, a place for the poor. Anyone with means was treated at home, where the physician called, the family nursed, and, as our Poisons episode's nighttime cottage shelf reminded us, the sick room was a domestic institution. The hospital was charity. To enter one was socially a confession. But asepsis, anesthesia, the laboratory and the X-ray could not make house calls. By the 1890s, for the first time in history, the hospital could do things for a patient that money could not buy at home, and the paying classes, holding their noses lightly, began to check in. The buildings adapted with unseemly speed, private wings, single rooms with good wallpaper, separate entrances, so the carriage trade need not share a door with the charity wards. Hospitals discovered patient fees as a revenue line beside the subscription book. Childbirth made the same journey in the same decades. From home, where nearly everyone had been born, toward the maternity ward, where within 2 generations nearly everyone would be, and the hospital's oldest exclusion quietly dissolved. The institution that once turned away the laboring mother at the temple boundary now built its brightest new floors for her. By the 1920s, the transformation was complete and statistically visible. The hospital had become the place where the ordinary citizen, not the pauper, not the soldier, the citizen, was born, was operated upon, and increasingly died. The house of strangers had become everyone's house. The confession had become an errand. And with the middle of society now inside its walls, the building faced its 20th century, bigger, busier, more mechanical, more expensive, more capable than any institution in this series, a white city with a boiler room heart. That city, its blood banks and breathing machines, its children's floors learning to let the parents in, and the night on which a Danish epidemic forced medical students to become, for a few desperate months, human ventilators. is the next chapter. Chapter 8. The White City. The 20th century hospital grew the way port cities grow. Every ship that docked left a new district behind. Most of the ships you have already sailed on. They were the subjects of our last 3 episodes, so this chapter can do the pleasant thing and simply walk the districts they built, pausing where the stories are best. Think of it as a tour of the White City at its confident noon. The era when the building across the street from our cold open acquired most of its rooms. Start with the district built by blood. Transfusion is old in ambition and was, for centuries, mostly catastrophe. The blood groups, whose discovery finally explained the catastrophes, arrived only in 1901. But even matched blood had a fatal logistical flaw. It had to flow, warm and immediate from one body to the next. Donor and patient side by side, vein to vein, heroic, occasional, unplannable. What changed the arithmetic was refrigeration plus an idea of magnificent plainness, that blood could be banked. The word itself was chosen deliberately by the man most associated with the founding institution, Bernard Fantis, at Chicago's Cook County Hospital in 1937, whose unit stored citrated, refrigerated blood against future need, and called itself a blood bank precisely because deposits and withdrawals were the model. The metaphor was exact, and this series salutes it. Medicine's oldest emergency, bleeding faster than help can come, answered by a ledger of blood, with donors as depositors and the fridge as the vault. War scaled it, as war scales everything in this century's chapters. The great conflicts built donor services and plasma programs on national scales, and by mid-century, every serious hospital had its bank. One more cold, logged, audited room down the corridor from Mike's, keeping the same kind of faith. Then the district built by breath. And here's the Copenhagen story this episode has been promising, one of the finest in the whole series. In 1952, Denmark suffered a polio epidemic of the worst kind. You know, the disease from our vaccines evening. Copenhagen's Blegdam Hospital was receiving, at the peak, dozens of new paralytic cases a day, many losing the power to breathe. The hospital had a handful of the iron lungs our 6th episode described, nothing like enough, and patients were dying in numbers that broke the staff's hearts. Into the crisis, an anesthetist named Bjorn Ibsen proposed something radical. Take the operating theater's techniques onto the ward, a tracheostomy and positive pressure ventilation, air gently pushed into the lungs by squeezing a rubber bag, the way anesthetists did during surgery. It worked, dramatically. But a bag must be squeezed around the clock for every patient for weeks, and machines to do it barely existed. So Copenhagen did the thing this episode will be remembering at the fireside for years. The medical and dental schools emptied their classrooms, and relays of students, many hundreds of them over the months, sat at the bedsides in shifts, hand ventilating the paralyzed hour after hour, squeeze by squeeze, reading to their patients and learning their favorite songs. Human beings serving as breathing machines until breathing machines could be built. Mortality in the ventilated fell by half and more. And when the epidemic passed, the lesson was institutionalized. If the sickest patients do best gathered in one place, with one nurse or better per bed, continuous observation and the means of rescue at arm's reach, then hospitals should have such a place, permanently. Copenhagen opened what is generally counted the first intensive care unit the following year, and the idea spread worldwide within a decade. The ICU, the White City's inner keep, the room where tonight's building concentrates its utmost vigilance, was born from an epidemic, an anesthetist's nerve, and the aching forearms of Danish students. The Iron Lung's successor, before it was a machine, was 1,000 young people who would not stop squeezing. Districts multiplied. An emergency department grew where the old casual receiving room had been, as the motor car, that reliable supplier, industrial work, and the century's sheer velocity delivered the acutely broken in numbers that demanded a specialty of their own. Triage, battlefield French, sorted into civilian routine, put a nurse at the door with the era's most consequential clipboard. The teaching hospital consolidated. The university-anchored model, pushed hard in America by the great reform reports of the 1910s, made the hospital the medical school's true classroom, which is why the building across the street probably has students in it tonight, trailing a consultant on rounds in a procession Al-Razi would recognize at a glance. National systems arrived in their different dresses. Britain folded 1,000 voluntary and municipal hospitals into a national health service in 1948. Other nations built their own arrangements, and this fireside, as promised, notes the fact and files the arguments elsewhere. And the hospital pharmacy completed the journey this series has tracked since Baghdad. From cupboard to dispensary to department to, in the second half of the century, clinical service. Pharmacists out of the basement and onto the wards, reviewing charts, adjusting doses, catching interactions, joining the rounds themselves. The professions return, after some centuries behind the counter, to the bedside where the bimaristan had always stationed it. Mike's job title, hospital pharmacist, is this whole episode compressed into 2 words, and the series notes with satisfaction that his shelf and his fridge have now both been given their genealogies. And one district arrived by the strangest road in the whole city, and this series would not dream of taking the bypass. The incubator, the warmed box that keeps a premature infant alive, was developed in late 19th century France, inspired, the tradition delights to note, by poultry incubators at the Paris Zoo. But the hospitals of the day were slow to invest in machines for infants widely written off as unsalvageable. Enter Martin Cooney, a showman physician of contested credentials, who did something that ought to have been disgraceful and became instead one of neonatology's founding acts. For 4 decades, at Coney Island and the Great World's Fairs, he ran incubator shows, real premature babies in real incubators, tended around the clock by trained nurses to the highest clinical standards of the day, with the public paying a quarter at the door to file past, and the gate receipts funded the whole operation, so that no parent was ever charged a cent. Hospitals had declined these children. The boardwalk saved them by the thousand. Cooney's survival rates that shamed the institutions. Desperate parents brought him infants from across the country, and among the fairground barkers and the carousels, several thousand Americans alive at mid-century owed their lives to a sideshow. The hospitals, eventually and a little sheepishly, took the technology in-house. The premature baby unit, today's NICU, the White City's smallest and fiercest district, was carried through its orphan decades on carnival tickets. This series has watched dimes fight polio and melons defeat sepsis, and rules that the boardwalk incubators belong in the same honored company. Mercy takes the funding it can get, and history should say thank you in whatever currency the miracle accepted. One more district, and the century's most humane correction, told gently as promised. The Children's Hospital was a 19th century invention. Paris first, then London's Great Ormond Street in 1852, with Dickens fundraising at the door, of course he was, and it saved children by the 100,000. But the early wards inherited a rule from the fever era that hardened into custom. Parents were visitors, and visitors were restricted. An hour on Sunday, faces at a glass partition, in some houses effectively nothing. The reasoning sounded clinical. Infection, discipline. The children settle better once the crying stops. And for decades, almost no one asked what the settling actually was. The askers, when they came in the 1940s and 50s, were a psychoanalyst of attachment, John Bowlby, and a social worker turned filmmaker, James Robertson, who did the simplest devastating thing. He put a camera in a ward and filmed one small girl, 10 days in hospital without her mother, and showed the film, A 2-year-old Goes to Hospital, to the profession. The settling, the film made undeniable, was not contentment. It was a child giving up. The resistance was real, and then it collapsed. Committees reported, rules fell, and within a generation the wards had been rebuilt around a principle the hospitalers would have endorsed without needing the research. The parent belongs at the bedside. Unrestricted hours. Beds for mothers and fathers to sleep beside their children, the family admitted with the patient. Walk any children's floor tonight, and the fold-out parent bed in the corner is the monument. One of medicine's great reforms, achieved without a single new drug, by a movie camera and a profession willing, eventually, to look. By 1970, the White City stood complete in outline. Banks of blood and milk and bone, engine rooms of air and steam, the keep of the ICU, the gate of the emergency department, machines that watched and machines that breathed, and the famous machine that goes beep, which this series, on behalf of everyone who has ever lain awake listening to one, hereby formally befriends. That beep, heard rightly, is the sound of the night shift's attention, automated and unsleeping, the Epidaurian priest making rounds at the speed of electricity. The building had everything, in short, except the one chapter this whole episode has been saving. What it is actually like in the White City in the middle of the night. who is awake, what they are doing, and why the quietest shift is the one this series loves best. Chapter 9. The Quietest Shift. It is time to go back across the street. The whole history is behind us now. Temple, Mercy House, Bimaristan, God's Ward, Charity, Nightingale, Asepsis, the White City, and the building stands where we left it in the cold open, lit against the dark. This chapter walks inside at the hour this series knows best, the middle of the night. Because the night shift is not a smaller version of the day. It is its own institution, with its own history, its own sounds, its own personnel, and for a series about sleep, it is the hospital's most beautiful invention, an entire profession of people who stay awake, on purpose, in shifts, so that everyone else may close their eyes. The history first, because night watching is as old as the wards. The medieval sisters kept it by rule. The statutes of the great gods' houses assign the veilleuses, the watchers, to walk the beds by candle, and the candle at the Hôtel Dieu's altar burned for exactly the reason night lights burn now, so the waking sick could see at any hour that they were not alone. Nightingale, whose lamp, whatever else the myth did, was a night shift lamp. The most famous image in nursing history is of a worker doing rounds at 2 a.m, codified the watch. Her notes are full of night, of the harm done by a banged door or a whispered consultation outside a ward. A patient's sleep, she wrote in substance, being the most precious medicine the nurse cannot pour from any bottle, and its interruption a form of malpractice. Her ward design put the night nurse's table where one seated woman with a shaded light could see every bed down both walls. The Victorian hospitals institutionalized her, the night sister, empress of the dark hours, making her silent circuits, and the profession has kept the shape ever since. Tonight, in the building across the street, the pattern Nightingale drew is still running. Handover at dusk, the day's story told bed by bed to the incoming watch. The long middle hours of rounds and charting, the shaded light at the station, the quiet code of who is sleeping, who is pretending, who needs sitting with. Night nurses will tell you, and studies of the shift agree, that the dark hours have their own clinical texture. Pain is worse at night. Fear is worse at night. The confused are more confused. The night nurse practices a medicine of the small hours that the day never sees, made of repositioned pillows, warmed blankets, and conversations at 3 a.m. that patients remember for the rest of their lives. The Asclepieion put the god on night rounds. The modern building staffs the role. B. Now come downstairs, because this series has a professional obligation to one particular lit room, somewhere low in the building. Past the tube station where the pneumatic carriers land with their soft thunk, the 20th century's most satisfying sound effect still faithfully in service. is the night pharmacy, and behind its hatch, someone doing the job this whole series has been quietly training you to understand. The night pharmacist works alone, or nearly so, steward of the sleeping hospital's entire chemistry, checking and dispensing the urgent orders that illness does not schedule politely. The antibiotic for the midnight sepsis, straight off episode 7's shelf. The antidote for the poisoning, off episode 4's. The clot buster, the anti-seizure loading dose, the labor ward's sudden needs. Reviewing charts for the interactions and allergies that are easiest to miss at 4 a.m. because the night pharmacist's deepest job description is being the fresh pair of eyes when everyone else's are tired. The last checkpoint. The referee of episode 7's stewardship working the graveyard slot. Answering the phone. The resident with a dosing question. The nurse with an infusion rate puzzle. The calculation double-checked out loud. Twice. Because night math is where the design for error philosophy of episode 4's ridged bottles lives on in modern dress. Tall man lettering on the look-alike names, the two-person check, the barcode scan, the ward stock counted and signed. And yes, reading the fridge log. The cold chain of episode 6 kept faithful through the dark hours, the vaccines and insulins and antitoxins sleeping at their prescribed 4 degrees, watched over like everything else in the building by someone awake on their behalf. Mike has stood this watch. This series suspects its listeners have now gathered why its portrait of medicine has always looked the way it does. The whole story, seen from the night hatch, is exactly what we have been telling you. Less lightning and genius, more logs, checks, shelves, and the patience of the person on duty. And here the modern hospital must sit for its one gentle scolding of the chapter, because this series has a conflict of interest and declares it. The building is bad at letting people sleep. Every listener who has spent a night as a patient knows the catalog, the corridor light, the neighbor's monitor, the 6 a.m. blood draw, the trolley with the one squeaking wheel above all the alarms. And the research agrees with your memory. Hospital wards at night routinely run louder than the levels every guideline recommends. Patients' sleep is fragmented exactly when their bodies most need it, and the irony has not escaped the profession. The institution descended from a temple whose entire therapy was sacred sleep, now interrupts it hourly to check that you are resting. The good news is that the correction is underway, and it is pure sleepy history in method. Hospitals now run quiet campaigns, night noise audits, a decibel meter walk down the midnight corridor, John Howard's inspection, reborn. Alarm fatigue programs that silence the beeps no one needed. Do not disturb protocols that bundle the night checks and let the stable sleep. Soft, close bins. Dimmed corridors, sleep masks and earplugs on the drug trolley beside the actual medicine. Sleep itself, in the newest guidelines, treated as a therapy to be prescribed and protected, with the ward's night noise as a clinical metric on the quality dashboard. Read that again from the right distance and smile. 25 centuries after Epidaurus, medicine is once more building its architecture around the healing power of a good night's sleep and proving it with counted decibels, the abaton, reinstated by audit. Before the chapter's last window, widen the lamplight, because the night shift is bigger than its famous roles, and this series does not leave people in the dark. Awake tonight in the building, besides the nurses and the resident and the pharmacist, The porters, moving beds and bodies and blood samples through the sleeping corridors. The building's circulation on foot. The cleaners, working the theaters and wards in the quiet hours, heirs of Chapter 7's sacred mop, whose 2 a.m. floors are as much infection control as anything prescribed. The kitchen's early crew, already at the porridge. The laboratory tech running the urgent bloods the tube station delivers. The switchboard. Someone has answered that building's telephone continuously, without one unstaffed minute, for longer than most nations have existed. The security officer walking the same rounds the medieval watchman walked. The chaplain on call, medicine's oldest colleague, still summoned at the hours when the oldest questions get asked, and the engineers below it all, tending the boilers and generators and the medical gas lines, the building's own breathing. Because the White City, like its patients, must be kept alive all night by people watching gauges. And one plain sentence of gratitude the research obliges us to add. The people who carry the city's pooled wakefulness pay for it themselves, in the disordered sleep and shortened rest that shift work costs. The watchers lend the town their own circadian health, night after night, which is as literal as generosity gets, and worth remembering the next time a hospital corridor seems slow to answer a bell at 4 a.m. Everyone in it has been awake on your behalf since yesterday. So stand once more at the window we started at, the lit one high in the dark building, and collect the payment this episode promised in its first minutes. In 1924, a lamp in a White House window meant the most powerful family on earth waiting, helpless, for morning. Light as vigil, light as grief. Tonight's window is lit for the opposite reason. Behind it, someone is on duty. A night sister charting, a resident at the monitors, a pharmacist at the hatch with the fridge log, the heirs of the veilleuse and the lamp and the students of Copenhagen holding the watch so that the patient beside them and the city around them, and the series notes, the listener falling asleep to the sentence, need not hold it themselves. That is what the hospital is at night. The place where wakefulness is pooled, gathered up from 10,000 households that would otherwise each be keeping some anxious vigil of their own, and carried, professionally, by a few hundred people on shift, so everyone else can put it down. The building stays awake so the city doesn't have to. There's never been a more generous arrangement of insomnia, and it is watching over your town right now. One chapter remains. The summing up. The whole cast under one roof, and the question this episode has been circling since the temple porch. What, in the end, is this building? Then the fire can burn down. Chapter 10. The House of Strangers. Here's a small thought experiment for the last stretch of the fire, and it is the reason this episode exists. Suppose you wanted to gather, under one roof, every hero this series has ever celebrated. All 8 episodes, all 4,000 years, the whole strange staff of medicine's story. Where would you have to build? You would need a pharmacy, obviously, a counter, and shelves for the apothecary of Episode 2, stocked with Episode 7's middle shelf, and Episode 6's humming fridge, with Episode 4's careful labels and locked cupboard, and someone at the hatch who knows what everything is and what everything does to everything else. You would need a ward with clean, spaced, well-aired beds for Nightingale, and a basin at its door for Semmelweis, and a theater with boiled instruments for Lister. You would need a laboratory for the microbe hunters, plates and stains for Koch's heirs, little paper discs for the stewards, a bank for the blood. You would need a records office for Grant and Farr and the searchers. Somewhere the counting never stops. Admissions and outcomes and infection rates. The bills of mortality running now in real time on glowing dashboards. You would need an infection control officer walking the corridors, the plague episode's health magistrate in a lanyard, a vaccination clinic down the hall from a quarantine protocol in a drawer, ready like a fire axe, an ethics committee where the ghosts of Newgate and Tuskegee that we have not yet covered in every hard-learned lesson sit as permanent members. You would need teachers on rounds trailing students for Al-Razi, music and gentleness somewhere in the walls for the Mansuri, a chapel, or at least a quiet room, for Basil and Fabiola and the sisters of 1,000 years, fold-out beds for the parents, a night watch for everyone. And at the door, this above all, you would need the rule the whole series has been walking toward. Whoever arrives, in whatever state, with whatever they carry or fail to carry, gets in. You would have built a hospital. That is the point. There is no other institution, not the university, not the court, not the temple, not the market, that could employ this series' entire cast. The hospital is the only building civilization has ever made where all of medicine's 4,000 years live together on one staff roster, on shift tonight. Every episode we have told you was, among other things, the story of one wing being added to this house. And what holds the wings together is not the medicine. That is the last quiet truth of the evening, and the temple chapter planted it. The medicine has been replaced, wholesale, 12 times. The humors gave way to the germs, the theriac to the antibiotics, and the building absorbed each revolution and stood. What has never been replaced? What makes a 6th century Basiliad, a 13th century Mansuri, an 18th century subscription infirmary, and the glass tower across the street recognizably the same institution, is the moral architecture. The strange, late, world-changing proposition of Chapter 2, that the 6 strangers need is itself the claim, and that a civilized place keeps a house where that claim is honored without question at any hour, from anyone. Everything else is renovation. A hospital, defined honestly, is a promise with plumbing. The promise that at 3 a.m, in your worst hour, among strangers, the door is unlocked and the lights are on and somebody trained is awake. And that this holds for you, and for the stranger you would cross the street to avoid, identically, because inside those walls, the distinction has never been allowed to matter. The Hospitallers said it best, and this episode has been saving their 3 words for the summing up. Within the house, the sick are the Lord's. Every gleaming machine of the White City is in the end furniture in their service. It is an expensive promise. The modern hospital is among the most complicated and costly things humanity operates, and the arguments about how to pay for the promise fill parliaments on every continent. This fireside keeps its rule and files the arguments elsewhere, noting only what all the arguing parties have in common. None of them proposes doing without the house. That is new, historically. For most of the past, the hospital was optional, a mercy some places had. Somewhere in the last century it crossed, almost unremarked, into the category of things a town cannot be imagined lacking, like water and the road. The moral invention of some 4th century bishops promoted quietly to infrastructure. When the historians of some future fireside sum up our own era's medicine, as we have summed up the leeches and the theriac, they will find plenty to wince at, and this series wishes them joy of it. But the buildings will impress them. The buildings that never close have never, on the whole, stopped improving. Safer decade over decade, gentler with children than they were, gentler with the dying than they were. And that last improvement has a founder this episode will not leave nameless. Cicely Saunders came up through the mid-century English hospitals 3 separate times in 3 separate uniforms, first as a nurse until her back gave out, then as a hospital almoner, a social worker of the wards, and finally, on the advice of a surgeon who told her that if she wanted to change how the dying were treated, she would have to do it as a doctor, through medical school in her 30s. One person, collecting the whole staff roster of this episode in a single career. What she had seen in all 3 uniforms was the white city's blind spot. The patient the machine could not fix, parked behind screens at the ward's end, undertreated for pain. The person the whole system, being built to cure, no longer knew how to attend. Her answer gathered everything this episode is honored. Modern pharmacology. She did foundational work on the proper scheduled use of the strong analgesics. Episode 3's oldest flower, finally dosed with Episode 7's discipline. Given regularly, ahead of the pain, not grudgingly after it. The medieval hospices, name and hospitality. The ward designed for peace, and the founding theology of Chapter 2, restated for a secular age in her most quoted sentence, that you matter because you are you, and you matter to the end of your life. St. Christopher's Hospice, which she opened in London in 1967, seeded a worldwide movement. Hospice and palliative care, now a recognized specialty inside the very hospitals that once had no name for it. And this series files her, deliberately, beside Basil and Fabiola, the House of Mercy, remembering its founding department, under a founder who had worked every floor of the building on the way, and the promise's scale, kept light as promised, deserves one sentence of awe before the summing up. There are today some hundreds of thousands of hospitals on Earth. No one has ever counted them exactly, which is itself rather wonderful. And the majority of human beings now alive were born inside one, which means the House of Strangers has quietly become the species' most common first address. The building where, for most of humanity, the story starts, attended from the first breath by people on shift. No institution in the series, no temple, no palace, no parliament, has ever been so universally the scene of the first minute of life. The medieval founders, asked to imagine success, could not have imagined that. The house is staffed, in the end, on the evidence of every night this series has described by people who keep the promise at personal cost on the night shift for strangers, which was the whole idea. So, the Ark, one last time, at bedtime pace, a hillside sanctuary where the prescription was sleep, and the desperate were turned away, a bishop's campus where the desperate became the point, and the medicine was mostly soup and prayer, a golden age house of the sick, where mercy and medicine finally married, with fountains. The great crowded wards of God, where the mercy rate outran the cure rate for centuries and the sisters held the watch. The subscription hospitals, Mercy Incorporated, with Hogarth on the staircase and Handel in the chapel. The counted hospital, the aired ward, the trained nurse, the scrubbed theater. The white city, with its banks and keeps and boardwalk-funded nurseries. And tonight's building, across the street from wherever you are. All of it at once, every era still on shift. The temple's sleep therapy back on the quality dashboard and the Samaritan still on the staircase. The longest continuously improving idea this series has ever traced, and the only one you can be carried into unconscious, nameless, and penniless, and still be treated as a lord. The fire is nearly down. The building, of course, is still up. It is always still up. That is the entire point of it. And the last thing this episode owes you is the ending every night shift actually gets, the handover and the dawn. And now there's nothing left of tonight's story but the good night. Come stand across the street one last time. It is the hour before morning now. The deepest of the night's water, the hour the watchers say is longest. And the building is exactly as we left it. The corridor's ribbon of light, the stairwell filament, the warm rectangle on 6 where someone is still sitting with someone. Nothing dramatic has happened in our absence. That was the shift's whole ambition. A few admissions taken in and settled, a few alarms answered and silenced, the fridge log initialed at its appointed hours. Some pain met with its remedy. Some fear met with a chair pulled up to a bedside. The pooled vigil held. And now, watch. The sky behind the building is going gray, then faintly rose, and the day is arriving in the only way it is allowed to arrive at a hospital, as a relief column. The early cars in the staff lot, the day shift walking in with their coffees, changed and scrubbed, the night shift gathering their coats, hollow-eyed and quiet, handing over bed by bed. What happened? Who slept? Who didn't? Who to watch? It is the oldest ceremony in the building. Older than the building. The sisters of the Hotel Dieu did it by candle snuff. The Veilus did it. The night sister did it under Nightingale's rules. The Danish students did it hand to literal hand. The watch passed on, unbroken, as it has been passed in this one institution, somewhere on earth, every single dawn for 15 centuries and counting. The night pharmacist signs out the Sogan steps into the morning, blinking. The city that slept is waking to its business. The people who watched it sleep are going home to draw the curtains against the sun. So sleep, really now. The lights you may see from your own window tonight are the right kind. Not vigils of helplessness, but the pooled and professional wakefulness of the kindest arrangement civilization ever made. The house of strangers holding the watch as it held it last night, as it will hold it tomorrow. Nobody is asking you to stay awake. Somebody is on duty, and the whole long story of this evening was simply how that came to be true. Thank you for spending the evening with us. If sleep hasn't found you yet, let it come now. The handover is done. The day has the watch, and there is nothing more that needs doing tonight. Good night, and as always, the rest is history.